The incident. Ben Carter's life revolved around hard work and perseverance. As a young black man working as a cashier in a bustling city, he knew the value of resilience. His mother, Dr. Cynthia Brooks, had raised him to believe in himself, no matter what obstacles he faced. Cynthia, a high-ranking corporate executive, was a powerhouse in her field and a single mother who had instilled in Ben the importance of integrity, dignity, and self-respect. To her, every person had inherent worth, regardless of their job or position, and she had taught Ben the same values. That particular day started like any other. Ben arrived at the upscale department store where he worked, a place frequented by wealthy patrons who often viewed the employees as invisible accessories. Ben knew his role well and took pride in his job, regardless of how customers treated him. He enjoyed the routine, the interactions, and even the challenges that came with his work. His colleagues admired him for his patience and his steady demeanor, qualities that often diffused difficult situations. But nothing could have prepared him for the incident with Charlotte Richards. Charlotte entered the store around midday, her appearance immediately catching everyone's attention. Dressed head to toe in designer attire, she radiated the kind of wealth and entitlement that often demanded immediate respect, or fear, from those around her. Charlotte was notorious among the store's staff, her reputation as a demanding, condescending customer preceding her. Today, her expression was one of deep annoyance, her eyes scanning the store with impatience. Ben watched her from behind his counter, bracing himself for what might come. When Charlotte approached his register, she didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she muttered about the store's inefficiency, flipping through the items she intended to buy with disdain. "Excuse me, ma'am, is there anything I can help you with?" Ben asked in his usual polite manner, hoping to ease the situation. Charlotte barely glanced at him, her eyes filled with irritation. "Just ring it up," she snapped, tapping her perfectly manicured nails on the counter. Ben, unfazed, proceeded with the transaction, maintaining his professionalism even as he felt the sting of her disregard. As he scanned the last item, a minor glitch caused a brief delay in the system, prompting him to apologize. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It'll just be a few seconds." Charlotte's face twisted in anger. "A few seconds? Do you not understand how valuable my time is?" She was practically shouting, drawing the attention of nearby customers and employees. "You people are completely incompetent." Ben felt a flush of embarrassment, but held his composure, keeping his eyes downcast and focusing on the screen. He didn't want to escalate the situation. And then, without warning, Charlotte grabbed her iced latte from the counter and, in a swift, angry motion, flung it directly into Ben's face. The cold liquid hit him with such force that he stumbled back, the shock freezing him in place. The store fell into silence, the sounds of transactions and conversations suddenly ceasing as everyone turned to witness the scene. Ben stood there, the drink dripping down his face and onto his uniform, feeling the humiliating sting of the cold liquid and the weight of every stare. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't speak. A wave of emotions rushed through him. Anger, humiliation, sadness. But amid the overwhelming flood of feelings, he remembered his mother's voice, her teachings on resilience and dignity. Taking a deep breath, he reached for a napkin, calmly wiping his face and attempting to maintain his composure. Charlotte simply smirked, clearly satisfied with the effect of her actions. To her, this was nothing more than a justified reaction to what she perceived as incompetence, a minor inconvenience that she would quickly forget. She turned, as if to leave, dismissing Ben as though he were beneath her notice. Ben's manager, who had been observing from a distance, rushed over, his face a mixture of shock and discomfort. "Ben, are you all right?" he asked, casting nervous glances between Ben and Charlotte. Ben forced a smile, nodding despite the sting of humiliation. "I'm fine. I'll finish my shift." The manager hesitated, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to confront Charlotte, whose wealth and connections made her a valuable customer. He offered a vague apology to Charlotte, who scoffed and waved it off, making her way to the exit without another glance. As she left, Ben could hear whispers from the nearby customers, some expressing outrage, others stunned into silence. His coworkers looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort, unsure of how to react. Ben wanted nothing more than to disappear, to hide from the eyes that bore into him, each one a reminder of the humiliation he had just endured. But he refused to give in to his anger or sadness. He knew he had to stay composed, to rise above the ugliness he had just encountered. With his head held high, Ben returned to his duties, determined not to let Charlotte's cruelty define him. He finished his shift, his mind a whirl of emotions that he carefully kept in check. He knew the incident would haunt him, replaying in his mind like a bad dream. Yet he also knew he couldn't allow himself to be defeated by it. That evening, as Ben walked home, the weight of the day's events pressed heavily on him. He replayed the incident over and over in his mind, questioning his reaction, wondering if he should have spoken up, done something to defend himself. But he had grown up knowing that sometimes silence and composure were the most powerful forms of resistance. When he entered his modest apartment, he found his mother, Cynthia, seated at her desk, reviewing documents for an upcoming board meeting. The sight of her brought a sense of comfort and pride. She had worked tirelessly to reach her position, breaking barriers in a world that wasn't always welcoming. Her strength had always been his inspiration. Cynthia looked up as he entered, immediately sensing something was off. "Ben," she asked, setting her work aside, "is everything all right?" Ben tried to force a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just a long day at work." Cynthia's perceptive gaze narrowed. She knew her son too well to be fooled by his attempt at nonchalance. Setting her paperwork aside, she walked over to him, her expression softening. "Talk to me," she said gently. "You don't have to carry everything alone." Ben hesitated, the events of the day bubbling to the surface. He didn't want to burden her, to add to her worries. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw the unwavering support and love that had always been there. He took a deep breath, deciding to trust her with the truth. He recounted the incident with Charlotte, his voice barely steady as he described the humiliation, the cold drink dripping down his face, the stares of the onlookers. Cynthia listened silently, her expression hardening as he spoke, a mixture of anger and sorrow flickering in her eyes. When he finished, she placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her voice steady, but filled with a fierce determination. "No one deserves to be treated like that," she said firmly. "You are strong, Ben. But that doesn't mean you have to accept cruelty." Ben nodded, feeling the weight of his mother's words sink in. She had faced her own share of prejudice and discrimination, but she had always held her head high, refusing to let others diminish her worth. He knew she understood the pain he felt, perhaps more than anyone. "Mom, I don't want you to get involved," he said softly, sensing the fire in her eyes. "I can handle this." But Cynthia shook her head, her resolve unbreakable. "Ben, this isn't just about you. This is about standing up to people like her, people who think they're untouchable because of their money and connections. You've done nothing wrong. It's time she learns that actions have consequences." Ben saw the steel in his mother's gaze, the fierce protective love that had always guided her. He knew that once she set her mind on something, there was no stopping her. And in that moment, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of justice that he had almost forgotten. Unbeknownst to Charlotte, the simple act of throwing a drink on a cashier would have repercussions beyond her understanding. She had dismissed Ben as insignificant, but she had no idea who his mother was, a powerful executive with the respect and influence to make or break careers. Cynthia Brooks was not just any executive. She was a woman who had fought her way to the top, who had earned her place through sheer grit and determination. And she was about to make sure that Charlotte Richards would regret underestimating her son. Unseen connections. Ben had always been determined to carve his own path, separate from the accomplishments of his mother. Dr. Cynthia Brooks was a respected figure in the corporate world, known not only for her brilliance, but for the integrity and empathy she brought to her position as a high-ranking executive. She had fought her way through a maze of obstacles in a field dominated by people who looked nothing like her, facing both racial and gender biases with a resilience that had made her a symbol of strength in her community. Growing up, Ben had watched his mother face every challenge with her head held high. She had always taught him that no matter the circumstances, he should maintain his dignity and act with respect, even when respect wasn't reciprocated. Cynthia knew all too well the weight of prejudice, and she had spent years building her reputation as a woman who would never compromise her values. Her influence extended far beyond her own company. She was a respected voice in the community, a leader on several boards, and a mentor to young professionals, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds. Despite her influence, Cynthia had never forced Ben to follow in her footsteps. She believed in letting him find his own way, even if that meant he would encounter hardships she could have shielded him from. She admired his independence, his desire to be judged on his own merit rather than on his mother's achievements. Yet she was always there for him, ready to lend support whenever he needed it, even if he rarely asked. But that evening, after hearing about the humiliation Ben had endured, Cynthia's protective instincts took over. She was furious, not only because her son had been treated so poorly, but because the incident symbolized the broader injustices she had spent her life battling. For Cynthia, this wasn't just a matter of personal revenge. It was about making a stand, about ensuring that people like Charlotte Richards understood that their actions had consequences. As she held Ben close, Cynthia could feel his silent pain, the weight he carried. She gently pulled back, looking into his eyes, her own gaze filled with resolve. "Ben, I know you're strong, and I know you've always wanted to handle things on your own," she said softly, but her tone was unyielding. "But this is not something you have to carry alone. You shouldn't have to accept this kind of treatment, not from anyone." Ben looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and reluctance. He didn't want to burden her, especially knowing how hard she worked. But he also knew that his mother was right. This was bigger than him. Cynthia placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, standing up for yourself means letting others help you. This isn't just about you. It's about showing people like that woman that they can't walk all over others without consequences." Ben nodded, feeling the warmth of his mother's words sink in. He knew her power and influence extended far beyond the walls of their modest home, reaching into the highest levels of the business world. But he also knew that her support wasn't just about connections or authority. It was about the strength she had cultivated through years of struggle, the sense of justice that burned fiercely within her. The next morning, as Cynthia prepared for her day, her mind was already racing with strategies. She knew exactly who Charlotte Richards was. Charlotte's husband, David Richards, was a prominent figure in the real estate industry, known for his philanthropy and extensive business network. The Richards family was well regarded in elite circles, their wealth and connections shielding them from the consequences that ordinary people faced. But Cynthia wasn't intimidated by their status. She knew how to navigate the complexities of the corporate world, and she understood that influence could be wielded in many ways. After arriving at her office, Cynthia made a few discreet calls. She reached out to trusted colleagues and contacts, people who would understand the delicacy of the situation and who shared her values. Within hours, she had gathered enough information to understand the scope of the Richards family's influence in the city. She learned that Charlotte held a considerable stake in several luxury retail establishments and was known for her condescending attitude toward employees. Cynthia couldn't help but shake her head in disgust as she read through the notes her contacts had provided. Charlotte's actions were a pattern, not a one-time lapse in judgment. Several employees at high-end stores had faced her wrath, each incident swept under the rug by managers eager to maintain her patronage. Cynthia realized that this wasn't just about a spoiled woman with too much money and not enough empathy. Charlotte was someone who felt entitled to treat others as less than human simply because she could. But this time would be different. Cynthia was determined to ensure that Charlotte's actions would no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, Charlotte Richards was entirely unaware of the storm brewing around her. She was preparing for a high-profile business deal that she hoped would elevate her social standing even further. As she paced around her office, overseeing the final details of the upcoming presentation, she reveled in the satisfaction of her success. She was used to getting what she wanted, and she had no reason to believe that would ever change. Her assistant entered the office, carrying a stack of documents. "Mrs. Richards, here are the reports you requested for the meeting with the Hartman Group. They're reviewing your investment proposal this afternoon." Charlotte barely glanced at the assistant as she took the documents, her mind already focused on the potential benefits of the deal. "Good. I want everything to be perfect. We need to make sure they see us as the obvious choice for this partnership." Her assistant nodded, casting a cautious glance at Charlotte. "Of course, ma'am. I'll make sure everything runs smoothly." As the assistant left, Charlotte allowed herself a smug smile. The Hartman Group was one of the city's most influential investment firms, and if she secured this partnership, it would cement her reputation in high society. She had no idea that her actions in the store, her public display of cruelty, had set off a chain of events that would soon undermine everything she had built. Later that day, Cynthia attended a luncheon for prominent business leaders, an event she had almost skipped but now saw as an opportunity. As she moved through the room, exchanging pleasantries and catching up with colleagues, she spotted a familiar face. David Richards, Charlotte's husband. David was deep in conversation with a few executives, his charisma and charm evident even from a distance. He was known for his philanthropic efforts, donating to various causes and supporting local community projects. Many saw him as the more grounded and compassionate half of the Richards couple, unaware of the true extent of Charlotte's entitled behavior. Cynthia approached him with a polite smile, joining the conversation seamlessly. She engaged with the group, her intelligence and insight immediately garnering their respect. After a few minutes of light conversation, she turned to David, her expression friendly but purposeful. "David, I've heard a lot about the work your family does in the community," she began, her tone conversational but carrying an undertone of steel. "It's wonderful to see people with influence giving back." David smiled, clearly pleased with the compliment. "Thank you, Dr. Brooks. My wife and I believe in using our resources to make a difference where we can." Cynthia's smile tightened slightly. "I couldn't agree more. I think it's crucial that those with power understand the impact they have, especially in how they treat others. After all, true character is revealed in our interactions with those who can do nothing for us in return." David looked at her, sensing the pointed nature of her comment. But before he could respond, Cynthia continued, her tone still polite, but with a hint of warning. "It's unfortunate, though, when people with such potential fail to see the humanity in those around them. I think sometimes people forget that respect is a two-way street, regardless of wealth or status." The meaning of her words wasn't lost on David. His smile faltered, his expression becoming guarded. He didn't know about the incident with Ben, but Cynthia's pointed remarks were enough to plant a seed of doubt. He managed a polite nod, but Cynthia could tell she had struck a nerve. As the luncheon continued, word of Cynthia's pointed comments spread among the attendees, many of whom were familiar with the Richards family and Charlotte's reputation. Cynthia knew the power of reputation in their world, and she had subtly cast a shadow over Charlotte's pristine image, making it clear that there were people watching, people who wouldn't ignore poor behavior simply because of a bank balance. That evening, Cynthia received a call from one of her contacts who served on the same philanthropic board as Charlotte. Her friend informed her that whispers had already begun circulating about Cynthia's remarks at the luncheon. Charlotte's behavior was no longer a secret confined to disgruntled store employees. It was becoming a topic of interest among influential circles. "Cynthia, people are starting to ask questions," her friend said. "Charlotte's actions are finally coming to light. It seems she's made more enemies than friends in her interactions with the staff at these high-end stores. This could have real consequences for her." Cynthia smiled, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't needed to confront Charlotte directly. She had simply allowed the truth to speak for itself, subtly reminding everyone that actions had consequences, no matter who you were. As she hung up the phone, Cynthia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that this was just the beginning. Charlotte Richards would soon realize that the world she had once controlled so effortlessly was slipping from her grasp. But for Cynthia, this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about standing up for her son, and for all the people who had endured indignities in silence. And she was determined to see it through, no matter how long it took. The ripple effect. Cynthia had always known that influence wasn't just about wielding power, but about knowing when and how to use it. The incident at the luncheon had planted seeds of doubt and whispers in the social circles that Charlotte valued so highly. Cynthia's subtle, strategic comments had set off a ripple effect that was slowly unfolding throughout the city's elite. It was only a matter of time before Charlotte would feel the consequences of her actions, even if she remained oblivious for now. Meanwhile, the pressure of the incident weighed heavily on Ben's mind. Despite his mother's reassurances and her resolve to hold Charlotte accountable, he couldn't shake the humiliation he had felt. Every time he looked in the mirror, he could still see the remnants of the incident. He could still feel the cold drink dripping down his face, the shock in the eyes of the customers, and the deafening silence that followed. Ben's friends and colleagues at the store had been supportive, but there was only so much they could do. His manager had apologized profusely, saying his hands were tied, and that he couldn't afford to lose such a high-profile customer like Charlotte. Even though Ben understood the economic pressure his manager faced, it left him feeling bitter and disillusioned. He had hoped that standing his ground and remaining calm would mean something, but it seemed that the rich and powerful continued to act with impunity. But while Ben was dealing with the fallout of his humiliation quietly, the news of Charlotte's actions was spreading among people who weren't willing to remain silent. Unbeknownst to Ben, several customers who had witnessed the incident had taken to social media, recounting the scene in vivid detail. They described the shock of seeing a wealthy woman throw a drink in the face of a polite, hardworking cashier. They recounted how Ben had stood with dignity despite the unprovoked attack, refusing to react with anger or aggression. One witness, a local journalist who had been shopping nearby, posted a thread detailing the incident and expressing outrage. How can someone think it's acceptable to treat another human being like that, just because they have money? She wrote, "We need to do better as a society, to hold people accountable no matter who they are." The story began to gain traction online, with others sharing their own experiences of encountering similar acts of entitlement and abuse. The narrative spread, resonating with people who had felt unseen or dismissed. By the end of the day, the hashtag #JusticeForben was trending locally, with people calling for accountability and pledging their support for the cashier who had been wronged. At first, Ben was unaware of the growing movement, his focus consumed by trying to push the incident out of his mind. But as he sat at home that evening, his phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from friends and acquaintances, all sharing links to social media posts and articles about what had happened. Curious and slightly overwhelmed, Ben opened one of the links and began to scroll. What he saw shocked him. Hundreds of people were commenting on his story, sharing messages of support, anger, and solidarity. Strangers from across the city were rallying around him, condemning Charlotte's actions and praising him for his composure. He felt a lump rise in his throat as he read the messages, a mixture of emotions swirling within him. Part of him felt validated, as though people finally understood the weight of the humiliation he had endured. But another part of him felt exposed, vulnerable. He had never wanted this kind of attention, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. As he continued scrolling, one comment caught his eye. This young man showed remarkable strength and dignity. It's about time people like Charlotte Richards are held accountable. Money and privilege shouldn't give anyone a free pass to act without humanity. Ben sighed, his emotions torn. The overwhelming support was heartwarming, but he was a private person, and the thought of his life becoming a public spectacle unnerved him. Just as he was about to close his phone, A message popped up from his mother. Cynthia, Ben, I saw what's happening online. Don't worry, sweetheart. This will be handled with care. Just remember, you're not alone in this. Her message calmed him. Ben knew that his mother's words weren't empty reassurances. Cynthia had a way of controlling the narrative, of steering things in the right direction without losing sight of her values. He trusted her, knowing that she wouldn't let the situation spiral out of control. Meanwhile, Charlotte was still blissfully unaware of the brewing storm. The next morning, she arrived at her office, head held high, focused on her upcoming meeting with the Hartman Group. She knew that this deal would be transformative for her reputation, solidifying her as a force to be reckoned with in the business world. She believed that her influence was unshakable and that no one could tarnish her standing. As she sat at her desk, preparing her notes for the presentation, her assistant knocked on the door, looking visibly uncomfortable. "What is it?" Charlotte snapped, not bothering to look up. "Mrs. Richards, there's something you should see." The assistant hesitated, clutching a tablet with a social media feed open. She handed it to Charlotte, who looked down with an irritated sigh. But as her eyes scanned the screen, her expression changed from impatience to disbelief. The tablet displayed a thread of posts, all recounting the incident from the day before, complete with detailed descriptions of her actions. Each post seemed angrier than the last, condemning her behavior and demanding accountability. Charlotte's face flushed with anger, not at herself, but at the fact that people dared to criticize her. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, practically throwing the tablet back at her assistant. "People are overreacting. It was just a stupid drink." The assistant swallowed, her eyes darting nervously. "Mrs. Richards, it's become quite a big deal online. There's even a hashtag. #JusticeForben. Charlotte's anger grew, her fists clenched. How dare these people try to tarnish her reputation over such a trivial matter? In her mind, the incident was nothing more than a moment of annoyance, blown out of proportion by people who didn't understand her world. "What are you waiting for?" She barked at her assistant. "Get the PR team on this. I want this nonsense cleaned up immediately. Issue a statement or something. I won't have my name dragged through the mud because of some cashier." The assistant nodded quickly, leaving the room to contact the PR team. Charlotte's mind raced, her thoughts filled with anger and resentment. She couldn't believe that a minor incident had spiraled into such a public mess, but she was confident that her team could contain it. She had always managed to maintain control over her image, and she wasn't about to let some online outrage disrupt her plans. What Charlotte didn't realize, however, was that this time, things would not be so easily silenced. Cynthia watched the situation unfold with a calm, strategic eye. She understood that Charlotte's reaction would likely be dismissive and defensive, but that was exactly what she was counting on. Cynthia had seen enough corporate crises to know that the worst thing a person could do in such a situation was to underestimate the power of public opinion. She reached out to a friend of hers, a well-known journalist who had been a vocal advocate for social justice issues. They discussed the details of the incident, and Cynthia made it clear that while she wanted the truth to come out, she also wanted the story to be framed in a way that highlighted the broader issues of prejudice and entitlement. "We're not going after her for revenge," Cynthia explained to her friend. "This is about holding people accountable and making them realize that no one is above treating others with respect. It's not just about Ben. It's about everyone who's ever been treated as though they're invisible because of their job or their background." Her friend agreed, recognizing the potential for the story to bring about a much-needed conversation. Within hours, the journalist published an article that not only recounted the incident in detail, but also explored the deeper implications of such behavior, especially in high society circles, where entitlement often went unchecked. The article went viral, reaching far beyond the city and sparking conversations across the country. People from all walks of life shared their own experiences, flooding social media with stories of workplace mistreatment, prejudice, and entitlement. The narrative had shifted from a single incident to a widespread movement, with calls for businesses to hold their patrons accountable and to stand up for their employees. By the end of the day, Charlotte's PR team was overwhelmed. They issued a carefully worded statement, attempting to downplay the incident as a misunderstanding and painting Charlotte as a misunderstood figure who had merely had a bad day. But the public was not convinced. The response was swift and merciless, with people calling out the statement as insincere and demanding a real apology. Charlotte was furious, but for the first time, she felt a sliver of fear. She had always believed that her wealth and connections would protect her from any real consequences, but now she was beginning to realize that the world had changed. Social media had given a voice to people who would otherwise remain silent, and that voice was growing louder. As she sat alone in her office, staring at the messages flooding her inbox, Charlotte felt a pang of vulnerability that she hadn't experienced in years. She could no longer control the narrative, no longer silence the voices demanding justice, and for the first time, she wondered if her privileged world was about to come crashing down around her. Back at home, Ben sat with his mother, scrolling through the messages of support and solidarity that continued to pour in. He looked at Cynthia, a mixture of gratitude and awe in his eyes. "Mom, I don't know what to say. It's overwhelming." Cynthia smiled, reaching over to take his hand. "You don't have to say anything, Ben. Just remember that you're not alone in this. People are standing up for you because they see your worth, your dignity. And no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, has the right to take that away from you." As they sat together, Ben felt a renewed sense of strength, a quiet confidence that he had never known before. He realized that his mother's fight was not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. And in that moment, he knew that this battle was worth fighting, not just for himself, but for the countless others who deserved respect and justice. A tarnished image. Charlotte Richards was used to controlling her own narrative. For years, she had cultivated an image of sophistication and influence, basking in the admiration of her social circle. Her lavish lifestyle, well-documented charity work, and glamorous public appearances had always shielded her from criticism, allowing her to move through life with an air of invincibility. But as she sat in her office, scanning through the onslaught of negative comments and articles, she felt that image begin to crack. The PR statement her team had crafted, a carefully worded attempt to minimize the incident as a misunderstanding, had backfired spectacularly. Instead of calming the storm, it had fanned the flames, painting Charlotte as even more out of touch with reality. People saw through the insincere apology, and the public response was swift and brutal. Calls for boycotts of her family's businesses spread like wildfire, and journalists began digging into her history, unearthing other instances of entitlement and questionable behavior that she had managed to bury in the past. For the first time in her life, Charlotte felt powerless. As she sat in her office, her phone rang. Her husband, David. She hesitated, knowing that he must have seen the news by now, but she answered, trying to maintain her composure. "Charlotte." David's voice was tense, lacking its usual warmth. "What's going on? I've been getting calls all morning. Do you know what this is doing to my reputation? People are asking questions about our family, our businesses. This isn't just about you." Charlotte's heart sank, her carefully built facade crumbling as she realized the full weight of her actions. "David, I didn't think it would go this far. It was just a small incident." David's voice grew colder. "A small incident? Do you realize that people are calling for boycotts? They're associating our name with entitlement and prejudice. I don't care about your little outbursts, Charlotte, but this has crossed a line. You need to fix this. Immediately." The call ended abruptly, leaving Charlotte staring at her phone, numb. She had never felt the sting of true consequences before, and the realization that her actions were affecting more than just herself was a bitter pill to swallow. Her husband had always turned a blind eye to her behavior, but now, Even he couldn't ignore the damage she had caused. Desperate to regain control, Charlotte called an emergency meeting with her PR team, instructing them to craft a more personal apology, one that showed genuine remorse. She could feel the walls closing in around her, her reputation slipping through her fingers. Her team quickly assembled a strategy, advising her to go on camera, to speak from the heart, and to address the public directly. Reluctantly, Charlotte agreed, understanding that her usual tactics of avoidance and denial would no longer suffice. The plan was set, a carefully staged video apology, with Charlotte presenting herself as contrite and willing to make amends. The PR team rehearsed her lines with her, instructing her on every word, every pause, every expression. But despite the rehearsed sincerity, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of resentment in her tone, a bitterness that she couldn't quite mask. The video went live that evening, and within minutes, social media erupted again. The public saw through her act immediately. Comments flooded in, calling her apology fake, pointing out her lack of empathy, and demanding real accountability rather than empty words. The apology video did nothing to repair her image. It only served to deepen the resentment against her. For the first time, Charlotte felt the weight of public scorn, and it was a sensation she was wholly unprepared for. Meanwhile, Cynthia Brooks watched the unfolding events with quiet satisfaction. She had seen enough insincere apologies in her career to recognize one instantly, and she knew that Charlotte's video would do more harm than good. The public was not so easily swayed, especially by someone as transparently disingenuous as Charlotte. And while Cynthia didn't take pleasure in another person's suffering, she felt a deep sense of justice watching Charlotte finally face the consequences of her actions. But Cynthia's focus wasn't solely on Charlotte's downfall. She was also concerned with the broader impact of the incident. She had spent years fighting for justice and equality in the corporate world, and she saw an opportunity to turn this incident into something meaningful, something that could bring lasting change. After the video apology failed to gain traction, several influential figures reached out to Cynthia, expressing their support and offering to collaborate on initiatives to address workplace discrimination and entitlement. Her network of contacts, built over decades, came together with a shared goal of using this moment to highlight the importance of respect and accountability. Cynthia organized a roundtable discussion on workplace discrimination, inviting both public and corporate figures to join the conversation. She made it clear that this wasn't just about one incident or one person. It was about creating a culture where everyone was treated with dignity, regardless of their position or background. The event quickly gained media attention, and soon Cynthia found herself at the center of a movement that was growing larger by the day. For Ben, the overwhelming support he received was both inspiring and humbling. People from all walks of life reached out to him, sharing their own stories of mistreatment and discrimination, expressing gratitude for his resilience. He was no longer just a cashier who had endured a humiliating encounter. He had become a symbol of dignity in the face of adversity. One afternoon, while Ben was on his lunch break, his manager approached him with an apologetic look. "Ben, I owed you an apology," the manager said, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have done more. I was too afraid of losing a wealthy customer, and I let that fear cloud my judgment. But I see now that what you did, how you handled yourself, it was worth more than any money she could have spent here." Ben looked at his manager, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. He appreciated the apology, knowing that it wasn't easy for his manager to admit his own shortcomings. "Thank you," Ben replied softly. "I know it's hard to stand up in moments like that, but I hope this has shown everyone that treating people with respect isn't optional." The manager nodded, his face thoughtful. "You're right. And from now on, this store will reflect that. No one should ever feel less than anyone else because of their job or their background. I've spoken with the regional director, and we're implementing new training on diversity and respect. This won't happen again." Ben felt a sense of pride, not just in himself, but in the positive changes his experience was bringing about. What had once felt like a humiliating moment had transformed into something far more significant, a step toward respect and equality for everyone who walked through those doors. As Charlotte's reputation continued to unravel, her once loyal friends and social circle began to distance themselves. She was no longer the admired socialite. She was a pariah, someone whose name was now associated with scandal and prejudice. Invitations to high society events dried up, her influence waned, and even her husband, David, was growing increasingly frustrated with the damage she had brought upon their family's name. David had always tolerated Charlotte's behavior, dismissing her entitlement as a harmless quirk. But now, with their reputation and business interests on the line, he could no longer ignore the consequences of her actions. He tried to mitigate the damage, reaching out to their connections, but the response was cold. The social and business world they inhabited had turned against them, and there was little he could do to salvage it. One evening, as they sat in their opulent living room, David confronted Charlotte, his frustration evident. "Charlotte, do you understand what you've done? Our reputation is in ruins. Clients are pulling out of deals. Friends aren't returning our calls. You have to do something. We can't keep living like this." Charlotte looked at him, her pride and anger masking the fear she felt inside. "I already apologized," she snapped. "What more do they want? It was a misunderstanding. People are overreacting." David shook his head, his expression a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. "They don't want an apology, Charlotte. They want accountability. They want to see that you've learned something, that you're willing to change. But all you've done is double down on your entitlement." Charlotte fell silent, her mind racing as she realized the full extent of what she had lost. She had believed herself untouchable, someone who could act with impunity. But now, stripped of her power and influence, she was left with nothing but the hollow shell of her own pride. Back at Oakwood Market, the store where Ben worked, customers continued to come by, expressing their support and gratitude for his resilience. People shared their own stories of facing adversity, bonding over shared experiences, and the hope that this incident would inspire change. One day, a local news reporter arrived, requesting an interview with Ben. At first, he hesitated, feeling uncomfortable with the attention. But Cynthia encouraged him, reminding him that his story had the power to reach others who felt unseen, who needed to know that they weren't alone. During the interview, Ben spoke honestly about his experience, recounting the humiliation he had felt and the strength he had drawn from his mother's teachings. He talked about the importance of respect, not just in the workplace, but in every interaction, and he expressed his hope that this incident would lead to meaningful change. The interview aired that evening, resonating with viewers who saw Ben not as a victim, but as a symbol of quiet strength. People across the city, and even beyond, began to see his story as a reminder of the value of dignity, resilience, and standing up for what was right. As the days passed, Charlotte's world continued to shrink. Her husband had distanced himself, her social circle had evaporated, and her business dealings were falling apart. She was left alone, forced to confront the reality she had spent her life avoiding. The wealth and status that once defined her had proven empty, unable to protect her from the consequences of her own actions. In the quiet of her once bustling mansion, Charlotte finally began to understand what she had lost, not just her reputation, but her humanity. She had spent so long viewing others as beneath her that she had forgotten what it meant to be truly respected, truly valued. And as she sat alone, her world in ruins, she realized that this was a reckoning she could no longer escape. A path toward redemption. Days turned into weeks, and Charlotte Richards found herself isolated in a way she had never experienced before. The opulence of her home, once filled with laughter, social gatherings, and luxuries, now felt like a hollow prison. She had been stripped of the power and influence that had once shielded her from the consequences of her actions, and for the first time, she was forced to confront the woman she had become. Charlotte sat in the silence of her once bustling living room, the weight of her isolation pressing down on her. She hadn't received any invitations to events in weeks, her phone had stopped ringing, and even her husband, David had withdrawn, spending more time at the office and rarely engaging with her when he was home. She was alone, left to contemplate the unraveling of the life she had so meticulously crafted. As she sat with her thoughts, her mind drifted back to her childhood, to the days before wealth and privilege had shaped her identity. She remembered her grandmother, a stern but kind woman who had always valued character over status. Her grandmother had taught her the importance of treating people with respect, regardless of their position or background. Charlotte had adored her grandmother and had once tried to live by her principles. But somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of those values, seduced by the allure of power and the comfort of entitlement. The memory of her grandmother stirred something within Charlotte, a flicker of guilt, of shame. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that she had not only failed others, but had betrayed the values she was raised with. She had become the very embodiment of the privilege her grandmother had warned her against, and the realization left her hollow. The next morning, Charlotte made a decision. She was tired of hiding, tired of pretending that everything would go back to normal if she simply waited long enough. She knew that if she was ever to find redemption, she would have to take the first step herself. She needed to face the consequences of her actions, not just to salvage her reputation, but to genuinely make amends. Her first call was to her PR team. She instructed them to cancel any future statements or attempts to manage her image. She didn't want another rehearsed apology or carefully crafted narrative. She was done with the lies. This time, she would speak from the heart, no matter how difficult it was. Meanwhile, Ben's life had also changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The outpouring of support from strangers, the rallying cry for justice, and the media attention had transformed him from an unknown cashier into a local symbol of resilience and dignity. It was overwhelming, but also deeply validating. He felt seen, respected, and, for the first time in his life, empowered to use his voice. His mother, Cynthia, had been his rock throughout the ordeal, guiding him with her wisdom and helping him navigate the complexities of his newfound visibility. She had always taught him to stand up for himself, but she had also taught him the importance of compassion and forgiveness. As the days passed, Ben found himself reflecting on what that forgiveness might look like in his current situation. One afternoon, as he sat with Cynthia discussing the changes at his workplace and the positive shifts he had witnessed in his community, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the message. A request from Charlotte Richards, asking if he would meet her in person. The message was brief, but it was clear that she wanted to apologize directly, without the cameras, without the staged apologies. Ben stared at the message, unsure of how to respond. Part of him wanted to dismiss it, to reject the idea of giving her the satisfaction of a meeting. After all, she had humiliated him in public, and her apology now, after everything had spiraled out of her control, felt like too little, too late. But as he looked at his mother, he saw the quiet encouragement in her eyes. "Maybe this is a chance to find closure, Ben," Cynthia said softly. "Sometimes, facing someone who's hurt you can be a powerful way to heal. You don't have to forgive her if you're not ready, but perhaps hearing her out will give you the peace you deserve." Ben nodded slowly, the weight of his mother's words settling over him. He agreed to meet Charlotte, not out of sympathy, but out of a desire to move forward and release the bitterness that lingered in his heart. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew that he needed to hear her apology, not for her sake, but for his own. The next day, Ben arrived at the small cafe where they had agreed to meet. It was a quiet, unassuming place, far removed from the grandeur of Charlotte's usual haunts. She was already there, sitting at a table in the corner, her face pale and devoid of the usual haughty expression. When she saw him, she stood up, a look of genuine remorse in her eyes. "Ben," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for agreeing to meet me." Ben nodded, taking the seat across from her. He remained silent, allowing her to speak first, to explain herself. Charlotte took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. I know there's nothing I can say that will make up for what I did, she began, her voice wavering. I acted out of arrogance, out of a sense of entitlement that I had no right to. I thought I was above everyone else, that my status gave me the right to treat people however I wanted. But I was wrong. Ben listened, his face expressionless as she spoke. He wanted to feel anger, to hold on to the bitterness. But as he looked at her, he saw a woman stripped of the defenses that had once made her seem untouchable. For the first time, she seemed human. Charlotte continued, her voice cracking with emotion. I've lost everything, Ben. My friends, my reputation, even my husband has distanced himself from me. And honestly, I deserve it. I deserve every bit of the backlash I've received. But I don't want you to think that I'm here to seek pity. I'm here because I needed to face you, to look you in the eyes, and tell you how deeply sorry I am for what I did. She paused, looking down at her hands, her voice choked with regret. I know I hurt you, and I know that an apology can't undo that pain. But I want to make amends. I want to do something, anything, to show you that I've learned from this, that I'm committed to being a better person. Ben felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Anger, sympathy, a sense of closure he hadn't expected. He took a deep breath, searching for the words that would capture the complexity of his feelings. Charlotte, he said slowly, his voice steady but firm. I appreciate your apology, and I believe that you're sincere, but I need you to understand that this isn't just about me. What you did, it's something that so many people experience every day. People who don't have a platform to speak out, who suffer in silence because they don't think anyone will listen. Charlotte nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I know, Ben, and you're right. I spent my whole life thinking that my wealth, my status, made me better than others. I'm ashamed of that now. I want to change, to use what I have to help rather than hurt. Ben studied her, feeling the sincerity in her words. He could see that this experience had shaken her to her core, that she was genuinely committed to making a change. But he also knew that change didn't happen overnight, that it required more than words. If you're serious about making amends, he said quietly, then I think you should start by listening. Listen to the people you've ignored, the people you've dismissed. Learn from them. It's easy to say you want to change, but it's a lot harder to actually do the work. Charlotte nodded, her expression somber. I will, Ben. I promise. I'll do whatever it takes. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them absorbing the gravity of the conversation. For Ben, the meeting was a turning point, a release from the bitterness he had been holding onto. He realized that he no longer needed to carry the weight of that humiliation, that he could move forward without letting it define him. As he stood up to leave, he looked at Charlotte one last time. I hope you find what you're looking for, Charlotte, and I hope that this experience teaches you something valuable. Charlotte watched him go, a sense of humility and gratitude washing over her. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that redemption wouldn't come easily. But she was willing to put in the work, to confront the person she had become, and to strive for something better. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte made good on her promise. She began volunteering at community centers, working with underprivileged youth, and listening to their stories. She sought out opportunities to learn about the lives of those she had once dismissed, immersing herself in experiences that were far removed from her sheltered world. She donated to organizations focused on equality and justice, and she used her influence to advocate for changes in policies within her social circle, encouraging others to reflect on their own privilege. Her journey wasn't easy. She faced criticism and skepticism from those who doubted her sincerity, and she had to confront the ugly truths about herself that she had long ignored. But she persevered, driven by a desire to be better, to prove that she could change. For Ben, life gradually returned to normal. He continued working at the store, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He had become an advocate for respect and dignity in the workplace, sharing his story with others and encouraging them to stand up for themselves. The experience had changed him, making him stronger, more resilient, and more confident in his own worth. And as for Cynthia, she watched her son's growth with pride, knowing that he had become the man she had always hoped he would be. She continued her own work, using her influence to support initiatives for justice and equality, inspired by the resilience of her son and the power of forgiveness. In the end, the incident that had once seemed like a moment of humiliation became a catalyst for transformation, not just for Charlotte, but for everyone involved. It was a reminder that change was possible, that even the most entrenched beliefs could be challenged, and that redemption was within reach for those who were willing to seek it. A legacy of change. Months had passed since the incident that had once shaken both Ben's life and Charlotte's world. What began as a moment of humiliation and confrontation had evolved into a powerful movement for change, transforming the lives of not only those directly involved, but also the community around them. This wasn't just about one person's fall from grace or another's journey toward empowerment. It had become a story of how a single act could ripple outward, leaving a profound impact on the lives of many. For Ben, the journey had been one of healing and self-discovery. No longer the quiet cashier who simply endured, he had found his voice and was using it to advocate for dignity, equality, and respect. He had become a symbol in his community, an unexpected leader who showed others that resilience in the face of adversity could lead to empowerment. And as his mother, Cynthia, had predicted, he was no longer standing alone. Ben had been invited to speak at various events across the city, sharing his story and his perspective on discrimination, privilege, and the power of kindness. His calm and humble demeanor, coupled with his message of forgiveness, had won him admiration and respect. His words resonated with people from all walks of life, inspiring those who had felt marginalized to rise above the challenges they faced. He spoke about how change was not just the responsibility of the powerful, but also of everyday people, encouraging others to stand up for themselves and for one another. One evening, Ben was invited to speak at an annual gala hosted by a prominent social justice organization. It was a black-tie event, filled with influential figures from the corporate, social, and nonprofit sectors. As he stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd, he felt a surge of gratitude and pride, remembering how far he had come since that day in the store. He could feel his mother's presence in the audience, her unwavering support grounding him as he began to speak. "I'm not here as a victim," he started, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "I'm here as someone who believes in the strength of human dignity and the power of forgiveness. We all have moments when we're faced with disrespect or prejudice, but those moments don't define us. It's how we respond that shapes who we are. And sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, adversity can become a bridge to something greater." As he spoke, he could see nods of agreement and faces reflecting the impact of his words. He shared not only his story but the lessons he had learned from his mother and the journey of self-respect that had transformed him. He spoke about Charlotte's apology, acknowledging her growth without excusing her past actions. It was a delicate balance, but Ben handled it with grace, extending both empathy and accountability in a way that was both healing and inspiring. By the time he finished, the room erupted in applause, and Ben felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He knew that his story had touched people, and that was all he had ever wanted: to make a difference, to be a force for good. Meanwhile, Charlotte's journey toward redemption had not been easy. She had faced a steep uphill battle, both internally and externally, as she worked to rebuild herself and redefine her identity. Her privileged world had collapsed around her, and she had been forced to confront not only her actions, but the beliefs that had driven her to act with such entitlement. It was a painful process, one that required her to tear down the very foundations of her understanding and rebuild herself from scratch. Initially, her efforts were met with skepticism and doubt. People questioned her sincerity, suspecting that her sudden change was nothing more than a performance meant to salvage her reputation. But Charlotte pressed on, determined to prove that she was genuine in her desire to change. She began volunteering regularly, working with underprivileged communities, and donating to organizations focused on racial and social equality. These were not just symbolic gestures. They were steps toward understanding the lives of those she had once dismissed. One of the organizations she worked closely with was a local mentorship program that connected business professionals with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Charlotte took on the role of a mentor, helping young adults learn about financial literacy, job readiness, and self-advocacy. Through her interactions with these young people, she was able to see life from a new perspective, one that was far removed from her sheltered existence. Each encounter chipped away at her old self, forcing her to reckon with the harm she had caused. She listened to their stories, their struggles, and their hopes, and for the first time, she understood the impact of the privilege she had once taken for granted. She began to see that true respect could only be earned through humility, empathy, and the willingness to acknowledge one's own flaws. One day, as part of her volunteer work, Charlotte found herself at a local community center, helping organize a job fair. As she arranged tables and prepared materials, she was approached by a young woman named Maya, who had once worked as a cashier in a retail store, much like Ben. "I just wanted to say thank you," Maya said quietly. "A few months ago, I saw your story online. I was treated the same way once, humiliated by someone who thought they were better than me. But seeing you own up to your mistakes, seeing you try to make amends, it's given me hope. It made me feel like things can change." Charlotte was taken aback, feeling the impact of Maya's words settle over her. She hadn't expected her journey to resonate with others, to serve as a source of hope. Her voice trembled slightly as she responded. "Thank you, Maya. I'm trying to be better every day. And I hope that in some small way, I can help make things better for people like you." For the first time, Charlotte felt a sense of purpose that was rooted not in status or wealth, but in the genuine desire to be of service to others. It was a humbling realization, and it marked a turning point in her journey. She was no longer working toward redemption for herself alone. She was striving to make a meaningful impact on the lives of others, to pay forward the lessons she had learned the hard way. Back in her professional circles, Cynthia continued her work as a powerful advocate for equality and justice. She had become a prominent figure in pushing for corporate responsibility, urging businesses to prioritize respect and dignity for all employees. Inspired by Ben's experience and the awareness it had brought to workplace treatment, she spearheaded initiatives to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, leveraging her influence to create lasting change. Under her guidance, several corporations in the city adopted new policies aimed at addressing discrimination and improving working conditions. Cynthia had always been a trailblazer, but now, her work felt more personal than ever. She was fighting not only for her son but for everyone who had been treated as less than because of their background or job title. One day, after a particularly productive meeting with a coalition of business leaders, Cynthia received an unexpected call from Charlotte. There was a moment of silence as Cynthia considered whether to answer, but her curiosity won out, and she picked up. "Dr. Brooks." Charlotte's voice was quiet, respectful, almost deferential. "I know this may seem strange, but I wanted to thank you." Cynthia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Thank me? For what?" "For being a role model, even though I didn't deserve your guidance," Charlotte replied, her voice steady but full of humility. "Meeting Ben, facing the consequences of my actions, it forced me to see myself for who I really was. And while that was painful, it was necessary. You taught him dignity, and through him, I've learned a little bit of that dignity myself." Cynthia's face softened, her heart swelling with pride and a touch of empathy. "Charlotte, I hope you understand that change isn't about one grand gesture or apology. It's about the choices you make every day, the small acts of kindness and respect. If you're serious about this journey, then keep going. Prove to yourself and to others that you're capable of more." Charlotte swallowed, nodding even though Cynthia couldn't see her. "I will. Thank you, Dr. Brooks. I'm truly grateful." As Cynthia ended the call, she felt a sense of closure. She hadn't gone out of her way to orchestrate Charlotte's redemption, but she had offered her guidance and support when it mattered. And now, as she saw the ripple effects of their actions spreading outward, she felt a deep satisfaction that the journey had come full circle. The city, too, had changed. Inspired by Ben's resilience, local businesses and leaders began to prioritize respect and dignity in their establishments. There was a newfound awareness, a shift in the cultural fabric of the community. Ben's story had resonated with people, and his message had taken root, sparking a wave of advocacy for equal treatment and accountability. Years later, as Ben looked back on his journey, he marveled at the transformation he had witnessed, not only within himself, but in those around him. He had grown from a young man humiliated in a moment of cruelty into a voice for change, a leader whose influence extended far beyond his role as a cashier. His legacy, shaped by the guidance of his mother and the support of his community, was one of dignity, resilience, and compassion. Charlotte, too, had found a new path. She had let go of her old self, embracing a life of service and humility. She continued her work in the community, determined to make amends for the harm she had once caused. While she could never erase the past, she found peace in the knowledge that she was no longer the woman she had once been. She had been given a second chance, and she intended to use it well. And as Cynthia watched her son flourish, as she saw the community come together in ways she had once only dreamed of, she knew that her own legacy was secure. It wasn't in the titles she held or the accolades she'd received, but in the values she had instilled in Ben, values that had changed not just his life, but the lives of countless others. In the end, the incident that had once seemed like a fleeting act of cruelty had blossomed into something powerful, something that would be remembered as a turning point for all involved. It was a reminder that even in moments of darkness, light could emerge, that even the most painful experiences could be the seeds of transformation, growth, and a brighter future.